For my Grades from the Past research project, I have chosen Alexander Graham Bell. For this video presentation on Alexander Graham Bell, I'm going to do a full biography of him, of all his achievements and accomplishments that he has achieved. Alexander Graham Bell was born in Edinburgh, Scotland on March 3rd in 1847. Alexander Graham Bell was homeschooled until he was 11 and then attended Edinburgh's Royal High School for 4 years. He really enjoyed science, but did not do well academically. While in school, Alexander Graham Bell had a very large interest in the sciences, especially biology. Once he had completed his first 4 years of school, he moved to London to live with his grandfather. While in London with his grandfather, Alexander learnt a lot from him. Learned so much that he wanted to become a teacher similar to his father and his grandfather. He became a pupil teacher for elocution and music. He took an interest in elocution from his father, as his father was a professor of speech elocution at the University of Edinburgh. Alexander Graham Bell taught as a pupil teacher in Western House Academy at Elgin Amora, Scotland. He was paid around $10 per session, and just following that year, he attended the University of Edinburgh. Once Alexander Graham Bell graduated from university, he continued his own research into elocution and sound and speech. At this time, Alexander Graham Bell was in his 20s, but sadly, him and his family were in poor health. He had lost both of his younger brothers to tuberculosis, so him and his family decided that they will move to Canada for a fresh start. They moved to Brantford, Ontario in the late 1870s. Since moving to Canada, the Bell family's health had gotten much better. While in Canada, Alexander visited the Six Nations Reserve to understand their language. So he taught himself the Mohawk language, and he translated the unwritten vocabulary of it into visible speech symbols. When Alexander was 25, he moved to the United States of America. While there, he opened his own school, and this school was called School of Vocal Physiology and Mechanics of Speech in Boston, Massachusetts. Mr. Bell's school attracted a large number of deaf pupils, and while working there, he also privately tutored Helen Keller. Alexander Graham Bell was more than just a teacher, he also was a scientist. At the same time he was teaching, he was also experimenting with converting music into electric signals. At this time in 1874, Mr. Bell was working with electric telegraph lines, which were used for Morse code. But he wanted to do something more than that. He wanted to transmit human speech instead of clicks. Now, Mr. Graham Bell had a major breakthrough discovering that human speech could come in wave-like forms. Now, he was hoping here that he could transmit voice patterns to a different location. This is where he got the idea for a telephone. Now, luckily for Alexander Graham Bell, he had a lot of financial backing from a few wealthy investors who thought his idea was genius. Now, just over a year later, Alexander Graham Bell had finally created his invention, the first telephone. He made the first telephone call himself on March 10th, 1876. The first words he said into the telephone was, "Mr. Watson, come here, I want to see you." and he made this call to Brantford, Ontario to his assistant. Here's a picture of Alexander Graham Bell making the first telephone call in history. Now, shortly after this, Alexander Graham Bell had a lot of people sue him for copying other people's ideas. He had faced 587 court challenges to his patents, and 5 of them went to the U.S. Supreme Court. Now, luckily for Alexander Graham Bell, he had won all those cases against him and did not have to pay a cent. Now, just around 4 months after building the telephone, Bell had improved it quite a lot. Bell was transmitting telephone messages over a line that was around several miles long in Ontario. On July 9th, 1877, Alexander Graham Bell had created the Bell Telephone Company. The Bell Telephone Company is still around today. It can be known as Bell Canada, and in the States as AT&T Corporation. A few interesting facts about Alexander Graham Bell. He also was known for creating the photophone and creating the first metal detector. Now, the reason why he built the metal detector was in 1881, after President James Garfield was shot. He invented the metal detector to try to locate the bullet. Sadly, the bullet was too deep to be detected by his equipment. Alexander Graham Bell also was one of the co-founders of the National Geographic Society in 1888. Sadly, Alexander Graham Bell had died from complications from diabetes. He died at the age of 75 on the 2nd of August, 1922 in Nova Scotia, Canada. In the honor of his death, during his funeral, all phones in North America were silenced. Alexander Graham Bell had achieved a lot in his life by creating the first telephone. He also had a loving family, 1 wife named Mabel, and 2 daughters. Alexander Graham Bell had changed the world forever when he created the telephone. It had a major impact and still does today. The first photo you see here is Alexander Graham Bell making the first phone call in history. And now the second photo you see is the drawings and sketches of Alexander Graham Bell's first telephone.